think the women's movement created a fundamental change in the way we think about people in this society and in the world. And one of the things that Hillary Clinton says, she said at the Beijing conference, is that women's rights are human rights. And now that that's accepted by the world community and the international movements for change, I think that's a fundamental revolution.
We'll start with Lea.
Well, my reaction to the film was that, in a way, I could relate to a lot of the things that happened because they happened during my lifetime. I don't know that I was ever really much of a feminist, though. I was interested in what women could do, and I don't think I ever was. To me, it took the younger generation to teach me what was really going on. And it's just the way, maybe because when I was in junior high, I got I was called behind the times. But it's very hard for me to kind of say how I feel, so perhaps I should pass it on to my next person.
Sure, I'm sure you'll get inspired when they're asking questions too. You know, I was really touched that that's a lot of my lifetime there as a small child and then through till now, and especially looking at these young women, I feel sometimes I've been leapfrogged because it was women older than me starting an incredible movement, and I lived through it. But now the younger women that are coming, and you know, seeing some of these young women on the screen, I'm just amazed at what's come, you know, before me and what's been happening through my career in my lifetime. And now I'm watching these incredible young women. You know, I'm at the State House and I see young women who are legislators, young women that I've seen come up from being interns to now being in staff, and how amazing they are in their confidence. And I think this is the good thing that we have done, you know, with the women's movement. But when I look at this film and realize that there's a bill in front of us right now about equal pay, you know, you have to wonder. You know, we just really have to work with this young generation to make sure that they don't forget that we still have to keep moving. But, you know, that bill was introduced by a very young legislator, a very young, wonderful feminist, Jill Krawinski. So, you know, I have a lot of hope with our younger women and hope that I'm some sort of a mentor for them. I'm trying to think of some of the other things. You know, there was some of the quotes in here that these young, well, they said these young women are no less feminist now. I think about things like, oh, you know, in the with the women and the secretaries. When I was in high school, I went to a Catholic high school, and I was in New York State. So New York State really, at that era, I don't know if they still do, but they really separated women from being college-bound or being, you know, career-bound. And so I wasn't allowed to take typing classes because I was college-bound. You know, I still can't type to this day. Worth the damn. But, you know, I just think about those things that, you know, like girls, you know, going, you know, if you were a girl and you got to be in that typing room if you were going to be in some kind of secretarial pool, you know. So I'm sure there'll be more things that we think about as we go on. So I'll pass it on to you, Christine.
When I first watched this, I watched it on PBS, and I saw the 3-part series, and the first thing I thought about is what an amazing teaching tool, because of some of the, especially from the 50s, I don't think kids really understand what it was like for women in the 50s and early 60s, and so as I try to educate the kids, I can't bring that out to them sometimes in such a short and concise way, and the first part, the awakening part, was just really amazing. That was at the beginning, and I just couldn't wait to buy it because I can't wait to present it to my kids. And I do it not because of just my women, but for the men too, because I think sometimes, you know, they don't make those connections. They have the, you know, the ability to go forward in their lives and not realize that there are a lot of women that couldn't do those same things that they can. So I really think it's going to be a great opportunity to educate kids and move it on. And I saw a lot of myself in a lot of those little things. I am known as a feminist at school. I have to have kind of my little spiel at the beginning where I ask how many people think I'm a man-hater. And I literally have about 5, 6, 7 kids raise their hands, and I have to explain to them that just because I'm a feminist doesn't mean I hate men, but I have a son who I love, and I don't want him to feel any less special than any of my girls. So it's an education process, and hopefully by teaching the women's history course, I can continue to do that. And so I look forward to using it.
Okay. I found that, of course, my response to this film is really from my perspective as an historian. And I've taught women's history a long time and written women's history. And I think I'll just tell you sort of the two sides of my response. And then I'd like to throw out some questions for you to think about. The first is, this is incredibly valuable piece of work as a film. And I really hope that you see the 3 parts, because this part is very truncated in many ways. I also want to point you to the fact that there's a website where there are now about 175 interviews from women. And many of them are just wonderful. And they're easily accessible, so you don't have to, you know, you can scroll through them, you can search them, you can find, you know, who were the women really involved in the movement, who were the women who were beneficiaries. And so there's quite a difference there. So as documents and as a way of documenting women today, I found this film just wonderful because these interviews will be preserved. And as a historian, they're really great because not only do they have the memories of women like Gloria Steinem, who you see only briefly there, but then much younger women. And their responses today are really about today, not so much about the history of feminism. And the second thing I really like about this film is that it's really engaging. I mean, the stories are so wonderful. And the beginning story, for example, about Catherine Schweitzer and the marathon was something I didn't know. And to catch that on a film was just amazing that, you know, we have that piece of history which is so physical. I just think that is fabulous. So from that point of view and from a historian's point of view, I just love this part of this film. And I think that because it's so engaging, it will, as Christine said, it will make many people want more and want to pursue this issue, and also to say, well, what was happening in my life? Right. Yeah. And how come I didn't know this? And so I think but the popularization of the history is really quite good through this film because it's so engaging. But I also have to tell you how frustrated I am with this film, to give you a little sense of how I see it. You know, it is a film sponsored by corporations, designed by public TV, and therefore it's not perfect by any means. And there's been lots of reviews of this. Is it a history or is it a celebration? What kind of story does it really tell us about feminism? And my biggest complaint, of course, is all the stuff that's left out. And this segment that you see leaves out so much more than even the 3 hours do. So please try to see the 3 hours because it's much more inclusive. Even so, who do you think started this movement? Which women?
The suffragettes.
Well, they weren't there. And that's what's missing, Leah.
Yeah.
So we don't have any of the backstory. We don't even have much about the precursors.
Yeah.
You know, the post-World War II women who were working all the time. They weren't just working in the factories. They were working in the factories during the war. Some of them were thrown out. But many of them couldn't afford to be not working.
Right.
And so they had to get different jobs. They've been working. There were women in the unions. There was lots going on. So we missed that. And you know, a film can't do everything, but it does appear in this film as if this movement just sprang out of nowhere. You know, well, how come? How about the civil rights movement? Now, in the longer piece, there are scenes of the women who come out of the civil rights movement, where many, many white and black women confronted this notion that they weren't being treated equally, but they responded in different ways. So what does it mean to be a black feminist? What happens when you have both race discrimination and gender discrimination and you can't decide which direction to go? So a lot of these things, some of it's touched on in the longer piece, but not in this shorter one. So those issues are so interesting. And then, of course, there were many different issues that the women covered in their attempt to gain access to society. It wasn't just mainly the economic opportunity, which is the main focus of this piece. Reproductive rights was a key focus, and that is very well described to a considerable extent in the larger piece. So that's another whole thing. The question of women's bodies and who owns them, you know. And much of what happened in this was sort of a private searching that went on within women's heads. What we call it was the click moment. When you suddenly realize that you're living in a world and a system that is not giving you a fair shake. It's not just my problem. And that's what the problem that has no name that's mentioned in this piece. That's sort of what women couldn't identify until all of a sudden Betty Friedan comes out with it and people go, oh, click, you know. That is the problem. It's not just me. But there were lots of different kinds of click moments. There were click moments for black women, for Chicano women, all within different sorts of context. So that's a really interesting part of the story. And then there's, beside that missing sort of historical context, there's the question of what is feminism? Do you get a definition of what feminism really means through this film? So I'll throw that out to you as the first question I wanted you to sort of think about as a result of this film. And what aspects of women's freedom, let's say, did you think the movement really has accomplished? You know, is it just the economic opportunity? Is it personal autonomy, you know, one's ability to make your own decisions in life and shape your own life? Is it the control of your own person, your body? You know, are we free of violence? That sort of thing. So which parts of the movement do you think this is typically called the second wave of feminism following the suffragettes? What part of our society really changed the most? And that, I think, is an interesting, debatable question. So I think the audience should have a chance now. But say what your reflections are.
Was Marilyn Cunin put in the series?
She is not interviewed. At the end of this piece you saw tonight really addresses the issues that Marilyn Cunin addresses, the work-family balance issues. And she would love it because this really advertises the problem very nicely.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought out what you did because I know my reaction is what made the film made me remember and to think about. And that was, for example, when I was in the Army, they finally got me behind a typewriter And the colonel that in charge of the office said he'd be damned if he was going to have any wax in it. I mean, that's an example of what women, and we always had to be proving ourselves at all times in all kinds of situations. Well, anyway, after I guess he'd been with, he was overruled by the commanding general, of course. But after a little time went by, he told us that he had had that reaction to our coming. And that he really appreciated what we were doing, and he was like kind of like a dad for us in a way. I thought he was old because he was 46.
Help but be taken back by how the makeup, like some of those women who were leaders, and with the dyed hair and the whole bit, and also, I mean, Marlo Thomas with her, I mean, she, you know, with her plastic surgery and all this. I just think that as being spokespeople, women for this time, and how women have gotten hopefully a better sense of who they are too, and so it seems that the aging process, and they're holding on to what the stewardess model was, you know, was really quite upsetting to me, you know, with the, and I know we're certainly out of the mainstream here as far as, look at
nail polish.
I actually tried to be a stewardess, and I couldn't, I didn't have the right fingernails. And I had to walk, we had to learn how to walk right and all that, yeah.
So how about this? You know, I just was listening to something the other day about, you know, people's opinions of whether Hillary Clinton could make a run for it, the next presidential election, and they talked about how old she would be, and they used words like jowly. I was so it was really offensive, and she's one of the sharpest people I can think of. But you know, it was just. But they went right to her appearance. Still.
Given all the jolly presidents have.
Yeah, she's just joining the troops. But you know,
Do any of you have any ideas how we can help men evolve? And I see it has come some way with some men, but there's so much work to do in that area. I've got 3 wonderful sons that have evolved, but what do we do about the rest of those men?
I think I really like your question, because I think one of the things that was missing in the film, which is portrayed as the story of the sweeping social movement in America. But it's only half of the people, because there were no men in the movie. And there were men involved in the feminist movement. And now it certainly was led by women. And also, you know, not only just their involvement in the movement, but the results for them and how men have grown in response. And there's one great interview on the website, and I can't remember the name of a woman who says this, but she says, feminism has been so wonderful for men. And she, we know it's Alice Walker. She says, feminism has been so wonderful for men. And she compares it to the way whites needed to adjust to black equality. It made them better people. It makes you a better person to begin to treat everybody as an equal participant in society. And it's true, there's tremendous numbers of men who are on board right now, and they do a fabulous, fabulous job. I think the problem you're focusing more on gets down to the economic issues, and who feels responsible for the basic economic welfare of a household, and how do men and women juggle that issue. And in a way, it becomes very personal for every family, I think, how that pans out, because that economic responsibility has to, you know, it can't always be equal depending upon the skills and the job potential of the people, of the couple, and whether they can share their home life on an equal basis as well as their work lives. And that's the issue that's brought up at the very end of this film.
Well, that has been one thing that's changed a lot. And
Yes.
you see men much more involved with their children than in our generation when we had children.
I agree, yeah.
I was in college in the late 50s, and so I was married and had children in the early 60s and was working. And it was that you absolutely had to do everything. I was working, but I had to be the room mother and take cakes to school, and I had to be the grandmother, and all of those things that we had to do because none of the other mothers were working, and I couldn't let them think that I wasn't a good mother because I worked. And so you really felt very much watched in terms of how good a parent you were if you were working, because they weren't working and they were good mothers.
I've been a single mom. My son was, I raised my son by myself, and so it's been really kind of interesting trying to raise him, not as a, I don't know if he's a feminist. I've never thought about it. You know, I never thought about raising him as either a feminist or non-feminist, but just to try to raise him to respect people, regardless of their gender. But I'm in a relationship with a wonderful man who has 4 beautiful daughters who are all very different and very strong, and who have to be raised in this world that still treats them differently. And it's been a great experience after raising a son to now start to raise daughters in some respects. And so it's really great to watch them grow and mature and to be such strong young women. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to raise strong young women and men to realize that there are differences, but at the same time that they should be treated differently because of those. So, but it's still hard. We still have discussions about, you know, who does what. And like he says, I sometimes have to let him do things because I take on a lot of the responsibility because I just do. So it's still that question of who does what. And I liked the quote in there by the woman, the CEO of Facebook, who said women have to let men do more. Right. And we don't do that sometimes. And so I'm trying to do that.
And I think it's so true about the parenting, that what I've seen with younger people, that the women just feel that they can do it best. But I think that the rationale is that they're not even aware of, it's a position of power. And it's the only position of power across the board women have, a mom, being a mom. And you know what I mean? So they have to say that they have to do this, especially when they're little, and then they establish the pattern, you know, with babies. Yeah, I do believe that men are quite capable of doing all those nurturing things, but I think women have a hard time relinquishing that role. And they have to learn that and trust their partners that the child is going to come home from the playground in one piece, just as if the child
Right.
Yes, I was thinking about unisex and how that came about two decades ago, and I don't know how to talk about that. I didn't like it. It didn't.
Like the unisex salon?
I didn't. Well, yeah. And that issue comes up with college too, in terms of all male, all female, and that came up with a lot of colleges that went into having both male and female students.
Yeah. I was thinking that one of the things I notice always is what women are doing that they didn't used to be doing. And then how many, well, for example, we have a woman minister in our church, and there are quite a lot of women ministers, and that would be unheard of not too long ago. And so I kind of think of it that way, of how women are coming into more and more areas that they never were in at all. I guess. Anyway, the film made me kind of think of those things, but it wasn't exactly part of the film. I'm sort of glad to hear that it's a corporate film, because I'll be a little more suspicious. I would like to see it.
So where do you get to see the whole thing if you didn't see it when it was on?
It's on VPT again, correct?
Yes, it'll air several times during March and April.
Oh.
You can also go to vpt.org and you can pull it down on demand.
You can watch it online.
You can watch online for free.
One of the things we haven't talked about is the role of conservative women in the whole history of the women's movement. And in the larger piece, you will see quite a role played by Phyllis Schlafly, who really is the symbol of the conservative women's movement. And she's a very important person in this whole history. And they do quite a good job of showing the role that she plays and representing women who felt very strongly during the whole women's movement that the movement did not speak for them. And there are many, many women who felt that way, and many who probably still do feel that way. And so I think that's one of the benefits of one of the positives of the film, I think, is it does bring that out, so that there's a voice there for an alternative kind of womanhood, let's say. She is a very interesting woman, very competent, very political. But what I find curious, of course, is her philosophy encourages women to maintain feminine difference and not to follow the feminist point of view with respect to equality, but to be different, be mothers, be proud of it, and so forth. And yet, her life has been spent doing the feminist thing, running a movement, speaking in front of people, being a politician, being a lobbyist, and so there's a great contradiction there. And that she can pull it off, I think, is quite fabulous, actually.
I chanced through what I think was a Christian radio station. It was an odd moment. They were discussing the new freedom of young women and that being expressed through overt sexuality. There is that whole power that has always been sublimated. Another oddity, President Moi in Kenya, there was a fellow here discussing something, and he mentioned, I don't remember the woman's name who received the Nobel Peace Prize in Kenya. She humiliated him by having a naked women's march. I wondered about that for years. Oh, that was supposed to be such an insult somehow. And, you say that to men, oh no, or there is such a power to the beauty and attraction of the female body that one learns more about as one ages and it disappears. And all of those women that had themselves harmed that we saw.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, because it's really the issue. One of the issues, besides the work-family issue, that's in the forefront today. And we call it sort of the pleasure-danger sort of dichotomy. That women, let's think of Madonna. Madonna was really one of the first celebrities to be out there saying, I am sexual and I'm in control of that sexuality. And I think that's sort of the message of what we think of as the most recent wave of feminism, that we have a right to control our own sexuality publicly as well as privately. And yet, what we see happening, of course, is increasing objectification of women in the media. And so there's that danger. Where's the line? How can women be out there and be sexual beings and yet not fall into the trap or not allow themselves to be objectified as sexual objects as opposed to human beings? And that's really an unresolved issue, really, if we see the problems that young women face today with pornography and also with the violence against women, because I think that most people believe a lot of the sexualization of our culture does promote violence against women, sexual violence against women. So those are the real cutting edge issues right now with where feminism has brought us and what are we going to do about it.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem I face a lot in my classes is I deal with a lot of girls, young girls, and it really scares me sometimes when I look out because they're going to be our future, and I want to make sure they leave my class feeling a sense of empowerment and understanding that they do have control of their lives, but at the same time, they are in some senses very unaware of what's going on. This past year, with the whole political issues about abortion and birth control and the Violence Against Women Act, they're very unaware of what was going on politically. And that kind of made me nervous, and I brought it in as much as I could, and we talked a lot about it, but it just, I still wonder if a lot of young women are going to keep pushing, and like one of the founders of Ms. Magazine talked about, it's like, are they going to lose everything before young women start to get really passionate about their own lives and their bodies and their futures? But with the mass media now, I think there's a lot more opportunity for them to be more aware of stuff. I'm not sure if they're really taking advantage of it as much as they can, but I think they do have this sense that, well, it's already been done. Why do I have to keep coming back to it? And that's why I still have this women's history class, so they can see that it's not done, that it's got to keep being talked about, so that they can continue to see that they've got to keep fighting no matter what.
The word that keeps coming into my head as you're talking is power, and what you have and what you use and how you use it and how it's perceived by others. So, we have to bring boys and young men into the conversation as well. I was just thinking about this conversation I had with a friend the other day, and she is highly competent, intelligent, really has something to bring to any conversation, any table. And she has a young son, and she came home one day and she said, I was so mad. She said, I came home and I had been in a room full of men. We were talking about doing some problem solving. She said, and I said A, B, C, and nobody would listen. And she said, and then one of the guys finally came around and said A, B, C, just like she had. And she said, it just makes me so angry. Why does that, they have to be a man? And her son said, well, because you're scary, Mom. He said, you're scary. And he said, you don't scare me. But he said, I think you just scare them because you're so smart. Yeah. And it's like, he's right. So what do you do about it?
But there are different formats. You can go from an academic situation where you're a star into a situation, thank you for showing, where you go to a job interview and somebody says, pull up your skirt. You go, what?
Yeah.
Okay? But that's very real.
Yeah, it's totally real.
Yeah. And there are men that are so obsessed with their children and doing well for their children, and many of them. So, yeah, you need to make it open. I know men that would do anything for their children.
I was thinking about what you had said. I have a daughter that's going to a commentator, not quite sure anymore. And, she's been in college, and I think that age, they're just not mature enough and sophisticated enough to get the bigger picture yet. But I think it's really important that you plant those seeds, because eventually it will, And she's going to be in a protest. She's out in Arizona about gay rights in Phoenix. And she said, "Mom, this is the first political thing I've done."
Nice.
And I'm like, "Oh God, I hope you just get hurt." I was like, "Yeah."
Well, I'm really lucky because I do every once in a while get a couple girls that just love everything about the class and about their lives, and they're always the first ones to speak up when some boys in the class say something stupid or whatever. And so every once in a while I get one of those, but it's really funny because it continues to be in a classroom where the boys do a lot of the speaking and the girls tend to hold back, and the boys will be the first ones to raise their hands and the girls will hold back. And so I don't let kids raise their hands anymore. I use cards because that way it gives everybody equal opportunity to say what they want to say. So it still happens, which is really kind of interesting. And I've been doing this for 15 years, and it hasn't changed in 15 years. So it's really kind of interesting. It's a great social experiment.
Yeah. The thing, you've already said this, but I don't think our kids, boys or girls, have that continuum perspective. Like they're living in the here and now.
Right.
They have all these things. It's like, what's the big deal about what happened before? They don't know, they don't get it, and they won't probably care until those things are taken away.
Well,
yeah.
The feminist movement really has helped. We have civil marriage now in the state, and with the LGBT issues and movement. I don't think it would have been, quite as well received, as it would have been without the feminist movement. I mean, it's really heartening to see young people being able to express who they are and be who they are, and that still has a long way to go. But I think this movement has helped that, which is really heartening.
Well, it's interesting with the comments to think about the young woman who started the auto repair.
Yes.
Because there she was, in a real situation, facing all these things that we're talking about that we think have changed quite a bit, but realizing that in her experience, she was still dealing with them on a very gut level.
Very interesting.
Big reminders.
I love that. I gotta get online and order one of those T-shirts. That's what I was thinking. Like, I want one.
Christine, are there other high schools in Vermont that you know of that offer Vermont history courses?
There's a woman in Burlington who teaches a women's history course, but I think I'm one of a very handful. I think there's like maybe 4, if that. I know of 2. I know the woman. I don't remember her name, but there's a woman in Burlington who teaches one. But I've been really lucky in the respect that, Spaulding has allowed me to teach the class. A lot of places just don't, because there's only so much time in a curriculum. And so I've been teaching this now for about 10 years, and there was a point where I thought I was going to lose it, and then I was able to work it. So I teach it every other year now because of numbers. And so that's why I keep going. I go to, whenever we have a social studies thing, I try to teach about women's history, especially Vermont women's history, because as much as we don't learn about the national narrative, Vermont women really don't get talked about at all. Clarina Howard Nichols, for example, is an amazing person, and not only was she doing a man's job, doing the editorial work in a newspaper, she went out west and was Clarina Howard Nichols.
Oh, go ahead.
She went out west to help end slavery in Kansas. So she was, if you talk about the civil, the causes to the Civil War, she should be there, and she's not. So I try to incorporate that as much as I can. And I love it because the kids remember that. They remember it, and that's really great. And it creates that connection with history. So, and this is one of my mentors who taught me.
Do you think the terminology of saying it was a revolution somewhat undermined it by having a beginning point, an ending point, and younger women questioning what's in it for me now?
So you're questioning the use of the term revolution?
The terminology of revolution. I mean, some of the early women who were involved, in fact, what we saw from the picture, the woman who was involved in the Boston Marathon, she didn't start it as thinking that she was creating a movement. She started it because she wanted to run the race. By the time she finished her race, she realized how important what she was doing was for a broader sense than just herself. And you can look at multiple different things, but as we kind of watch the show, they talk about a revolution. And does the terminology of revolution, civil rights movement, you and I were on we're discussing the abolitionists, and we're still fighting for civil rights.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, you have to talk about the use of the word revolution. If we wanted to compare it to other revolutions, I mean, there's always problems with them. Do Black Americans feel they're totally equal now? There's lots of issues still. Remember the Communist Revolution? Was it great for everybody? No. So that doesn't mean that we can't use the term revolution. But when you think about the term revolution, it means a fundamental change in people's thinking and way of doing things. I think the women's movement created a fundamental change in the way we think about people in this society and in the world. And one of the things that Hillary Clinton says, she said at the Beijing conference, is that women's rights are human rights. And now that that's accepted by the world community and the international movements for change, I think that's a fundamental revolution, because women's rights have not been considered human rights. And that's the kind of revolution I think we're talking about, even though it's not complete. I think stalled revolution, unfinished revolution, ongoing revolution is all a good way to talk about some of these issues that, you know, they're still unresolved and frustrating to people.
Well, I was thinking from the standpoint of the daughters of the activists.
Yeah.
Felt that, you know, it isn't meaningful to me.
Mm-hmm. But it is meaningful to those young feminists at the very end of the film. So there's a whole new group that see it a little differently, too. So it's hard to say.
It's true, because I mean, even though the daughter was not, maybe she wasn't calling herself a feminist, what this has brought issues that are there is always going to be a tension around work and family, and but it brought out so you could talk about it, so you could have it out there. It's real. You know, you have conversations about this all the time now. And before, I think it was really what you would have been a pariah if you tried to say, you know, I don't know if I'm a really good mother. I really want to be doing something different. Is there something wrong with me? It was that silent thing. So, you know, we're talking about it now, and we're trying to do things, you know, that will, you know, help people figure out how to balance it all, so that, you know, we're doing well by our children, but, you know, we're also, our workforce is you know, has the great resources of both men and women in the workforce.
One comment of Oprah's really brought back a memory for me. When my mother was still a single woman working in New York City, in a pretty good job with the New York Central as a foreign exchange calculator for bills of lading that came in and were shipped by train. And some of the men in the office were off to World War I. This was a long time ago. And she was given the job of another man to do in addition to her own work. And so she went to the boss and said, well, if I'm doing Mr. McCarthy's work, I should get his pay in addition to my own. I said, oh, I couldn't pay a woman that much. And it's still happening in Oprah's day. I didn't know that.
It's happening now.
Yeah, it's happening now.
But you notice when it happened, she didn't immediately do anything about it.
No.
Because she didn't think that she could. Because there wasn't a movement in progress. There wasn't a movement to continue the pay equity, you know, in a sense. By the 80s, she thought she could work it, and she did, obviously. But
I bet she's making more than that guy now.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to harbor your resources, you know. Oprah Winfrey.
Yeah, she was right that she caused a ruckus that we'd never hear of her. She'd be blackballed from everything. So she did it differently and came out much better off.
Yeah, so I mean, there are different pathways.
Yeah. Choose your battles.
I think that's one of the biggest surprises when I talk to my kids, is the fact that women still don't make the same as men in some jobs. Like the kids will go, well, what about your job? Well, my job is different because I'm a teacher and we do it collectively, but if they wanted to go into a different, right, and I'm in a union, so it helps that, but you know, if they went out into the workforce and went into any higher level jobs, they'd get paid less. And I think about Lilly Ledbetter, you know, and the whole Lilly Ledbetter Act and how difficult that was to get passed, and you know, and we talk a little bit about that. And so she was a hero in my eyes, because even though she didn't win, she got a movement going that got us talking again about the equal pay and the Equal Pay Act and things like that. So it's a constant discussion that we got to keep having, and hopefully things will change. You go in.
I think one of the dynamics that you have to work with too is that kids have a tendency to rebel against their parents.
Yes.
And I think of I have 4 daughters. I have a 20-year-old, I have an 8-year-old, and I have 2 in between. So it's really interesting to see what their experiences are. The 8-year-old will have grown up with 2 female secretaries of state, most of the major roles in our government having been held by women. It's a totally different thing than what her 20-year-old sister grew up with. And it was really interesting this year especially, I think that my 20-year-old takes a lot of stuff for granted because she's lived in a pretty feminist-oriented household, and her mom and I have made real efforts to be very even about everything, but she was really offended by a lot of the sexual politics that came out in the election this year. She's 20, it's really the first presidential national campaign that she's been self-aware of, and it was really interesting to kind of see her awaken to the political dynamic that I think maybe she had taken for granted for a long time. So I think the question is, I think we're post-revolution now, and how do we maintain that to offset the kids who are rebelling against what their parents did, even though it could undermine the gains. And just, I think it's fantastic that the kids have a great threshold now that they can go from, but that not to forget what price was paid to get there.
I want to thank everybody for being here, for the panel for staging, and for all the audience members who spoke, and the great listeners. This has been a fabulous discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I forgot to mention